think we're going to go ahead and get started. A few more people should be trickling in, I'm sure, but we'll just go ahead and start now. The third panelist on this first panel will be here a bit late, but we're just going to start, and he'll be joining us very soon. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Kugelman, Program Associate with the Wilson Center's Asia Program. Thanks to everyone for coming today. I'd like to recognize the Asia Program's partner for this event, the Wilson Center's Middle East Program. Specifically, I thank Hale Esfandiari, who directs the Middle East Program, as well as Azucena Rodriguez. Many thanks for your help and support. Separately, I'd like to thank my colleagues with the Asia Program, and particularly Sue Lee, who is indispensable in helping put this event together. It's estimated that Al Jazeera English, the English language service of the Al Jazeera network, reaches about 100 million homes worldwide. By comparison, the BBC World Television station reaches around 280 million homes. Now, that's much more than 100 million, but to keep things in perspective, while the BBC has been around for decades, Al Jazeera English, or AJE, was launched just over 2 years ago. And of the 100 million homes that receive AJE's programming, relatively few are in the United States. As many of you know, most cable providers in this country don't offer the station. However, AJE can be seen on the website YouTube, where it reportedly gets many hits from viewers based in this country. AJE can be seen in about 60 different countries. Its presence is particularly strong in the Asia-Pacific region, where it can be seen on TV from New Zealand to Japan. This presence is particularly notable in Southeast Asia. One of AJE's 4 broadcast centers is in Malaysia, and bureaus currently exist in Sydney, Jakarta, and Manila, with Bangkok, I believe, perhaps next. Now, it's undeniable that the Al Jazeera network has generated controversy. For this reason, it's important to understand what Al Jazeera is really all about. The objective today is to shine a light on AJE, on its operations, its coverage, and its potential impacts. We'll be using Southeast Asia as the main focus area, but we will also make broader connections with the Middle East and the world as a whole. We'll talk about the origins of AJE's presence in Asia, about the media environment in Southeast Asia and how AJE fits into it, about AJE's selection of news coverage, about the notion of an Al Jazeera effect in Southeast Asia, and about how this can all be applied more globally. We're very fortunate to be joined today by journalists and media experts from the United States, from Asia, and elsewhere, who will look into these issues. Before we start, just a few administrative comments. First of all, please turn off all cell phones, pagers, anything like that. That goes for audience members and people up here. Our sound system could do very unfortunate things if those happen to be on. Finally, this first panel, after this first panel ends, we'll have about a 15-minute break, during which time you're welcome to help yourself to light refreshments in the hallway. Just ask that you come back after 15 minutes, because the second panel will be scheduled to begin 15 minutes later at 3:30, and we like to keep things timely so that we can return on time. So let's begin with this first panel. You should have a sheet with the speakers' bios on them, so I'll be relatively brief as I introduce each speaker before his or her presentation. We're first going to hear from Drew McDaniel, who is professor and director of the Center for International Studies at Ohio University. He's also a consultant to the Asia-Pacific Institute for Broadcasting Development in Malaysia, and he's a past director of Ohio University's Center for Southeast Asian Studies and School of Telecommunications. And he's published numerous works on Southeast Asia media issues, including Electronic Tigers of Southeast Asia, The Politics of Media and Technology. So with that, I introduce Professor McDaniel.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate very much the opportunity to be here today and to learn from this great group of experts who've been gathered today to take up this topic. My role is one of providing a backdrop, really, for a discussion of Al Jazeera. And what I will try to do in the next few minutes is present to you a picture of media in Southeast Asia, particularly focusing on 2 countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, the leading Islamic nations of Southeast Asia. Now, because I'm talking about Southeast Asia, perhaps it would be a good idea to quickly review what we mean by Southeast Asia. For decades, when we talked about Southeast Asia, we've referred to 10 countries, the 10 that you see noted here. But of course, there's an 11th country that's been added right here, and you would recognize that as Timor-Leste, or East Timor. If you don't mind, I'm going to start this discussion by turning the clock back to the independence era. And at independence, both Indonesia and Malaysia imposed state-controlled media policies. Now, this is really not very different than most developing countries as they gained independence. And as many scholars have noted, perhaps the reason for this is not that there was some intention on the part of governments to take control of of media and impose a status policy, but in fact that's the system that had been put in place in most of these countries during the colonial era. The colonial governments were very intent on suppressing independence movements in many cases, and in order to achieve that aim, they put into place a statist media regime. In Indonesia, broadcasting was based upon a monopoly for Radio Republik Indonesia. Later, it was expanded with the introduction of television to include television, TVRI. And in Malaysia, broadcasting was the responsibility of Radio Malaysia. Later, with the introduction of television, Radio Television Malaysia. Hereafter, I'll refer to it as RTM. Now, these monopolies were maintained throughout the 1960s and the 70s in the interest of national unification. I should note that there were hundreds of very low-power radio stations authorized in Indonesia through the 1960s and 70s, but their role was insignificant. They weren't networked together, and most of them were not engaged in any kind of information broadcasting. Indeed, they were prevented from that. They had to carry national news broadcasts from Radio Republik Indonesia. But the purpose of these monopolies, or so it was said, was to achieve national unification. And unification was a problem in these two countries, but for very different reasons. First, if we look at Malaysia, Malay constitute the majority, about two-thirds, 60%, between 60% and two-thirds of the population. Chinese are the next largest group, about 30% of the population, while Indians represent most of the remainder, about 10%. Most of them primarily Tamil from South India. The Chinese had been immigrating into Southeast Asia for centuries, but their rate of immigration sped up rapidly at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when the British government enacted policies to import labor, primarily for tin mining for the Chinese, and work in the rubber tapping industry for the Indians. In these two cases, the British viewed Indians and Chinese to be guest workers and made no provision for their integration. So at the time of independence, we had disparate populations. There had never been an effort meant to unify these populations. Indeed, the Chinese have been allowed to establish their own school systems, allowed to train themselves in the traditions of China, and as a result, we had very deeply divided societies. This led ultimately to a watershed event on May 13th in 1969. Communal violence broke out, in which hundreds of people were killed and emergency orders were invoked. This spate of violence led to the establishment of rules that Americans would recognize as an affirmative action agenda. It was meant to give Malays access to the education and economic opportunities Malaysia presented. For example, in 1969, it was found that 80% of the domestic investment in Malaysia was within the Chinese community. Only a little over 10% of domestic investment came from the Malay community, even though they constituted roughly two-thirds of the population. So you see, there was a huge economic disparity meant to be addressed by these new policies. And in the aftermath, media were made not just important tools of integration, they were made the main tool of national integration in Malaysia. Now, the diversity in Indonesia was quite different. First of all, it's a regional diversity based on its status as an island nation made up of, people commonly say 13,000, but there's something more than 17,000 islands, most of them not populated. But even so, the residents, numbering about 225 million, make it the fourth most populous nation on Earth. Scattered across these islands, divided pockets of population, island by island, you can see that national integration is a huge problem in Indonesia. It's complicated by the fact that the Javanese are the largest and the most influential of the ethnic groups. And they're at the center of Indonesia. In fact, Java is considered the central island of Indonesia. Other groups, such as Madurese, Minangkabau, Achenese, Timorese, Sundanese, and many, many more, create a hugely socially divided nation, and in many cases speaking a completely different language. It led to the national motto, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, which means unity and diversity. It's normal translation, but it actually means literally many yet one. But in actual practice, we saw how fragile that unity was when, in the post-Suharto era, the country was racked and continues to be racked by ethnic and religious clashes, and so continues to be a serious problem in Indonesia. Just a quick glance across the span of the country, you can see how diverse, how divided the country must be, of a country that spans something like 1,600 miles, and sitting at the center is Java. Now, with media functioning as the foremost mechanism to create national unification, we find a problem has occurred in the last decade and a half, because changing media technology has undermined efforts to maintain state control. Previously, state control had been easy. We can trace this back to the late 1970s, during which period consumer videotape became enormously popular. I can remember in Kuala Lumpur in the 1980s, if you went to a shopping center, all of the crowd would be surrounding the video stores, and Chinese would throng there to see the Chinese serials imported from Hong Kong, and this was something they couldn't see on their own local television. At the time, Radio Television Malaysia transmitted one film per week for the Chinese community and 15 minutes news in Mandarin each day. That was it. And so you can see that there was a huge demand for programming in Chinese languages. Other technologies arrived in succession. Direct-to-home satellites, DVDs, internet, so on. You're all familiar with these. They certainly came to the region. These media alternatives were much more popular than the state media. And so they effectively undermined state control over electronic mass communication across the entire region. It was complicated by the fact that in both countries they had set themselves apart to exploit advanced technology. In 1974, Malaysia had become the world's largest offshore producer of electronic goods. It maintains that status today. You may not know this, but the United States is the 14th largest trading partner of the United States. And of course, the United States is Malaysia's largest trading partner. And this is primarily because of this huge electronic industry. If you open up your television set or your computer and look at those chips, undoubtedly a large number of them will say, made in Malaysia. That meant that domestically available were all of these new technologies. Well, building on that, in the 1990s, Malaysia embarked on an ambitious plan to exploit the internet and its associated technologies, the Multimedia Super Corridor. The Multimedia Super Corridor was meant to be a reservation, a high-tech reservation to attract foreign direct investment in these high-tech industries. And Malaysian government hoped that this would launch Malaysia as a regional high-tech center for certainly all of Southeast Asia, but it hoped all of Asia in general. That was Malaysia. Indonesia took a different path. Indonesia was the first country to enact and put into service a domestic satellite system, the first non-industrial nation. It was a fourth of any nation to put a system in place based upon direct broadcasting satellites. Known as Palapa, the system covered the entire country with television signals of TVRI, but not only that, but because there was excess channel capacity, the Indonesian government rented transponders to neighboring countries so they too could relay their television signal across their own countries. But in so doing, they made those television signals available across the entire archipelago. And in Indonesia, many tens of thousands of homemade earth stations were built and sold for consumer use at the price of a few $100s. You could go in a village anywhere in Indonesia in the 1980s and purchase one of these earth stations for $200 or $300. The dish was made out of chicken wire. It was made out of spare components, very cleverly made, but perfectly functional. And by the time the Indonesian government had realized that the signals that were being picked up were not Indonesian signals, but one from Malaysia in particular, but also from Thailand and the Philippines, by the time they realized that, it was too late. It was a political impossibility to then outlaw these earth stations. The result was a growing audience that did not receive government messages, and therefore its unification message. Now, it's interesting the strategy employed by both of these countries to counter these technology trends. Both countries hitched media to domestic neoliberal economic reforms, and that meant privatizing the media. In Malaysia, new private commercial broadcast licenses were issued to the ruling party's trusted political allies only, who could be depended upon to rigorously support government policies. So while they granted these licenses, they were crony politicians tied to UMNO or one of the other Barisan Nasional parties. In Indonesia, they took a slightly different approach. Additional private commercial broadcast licenses were issued to corporations that were owned in part by Suharto family members. So by the end of the Suharto era, we had the two state monopoly broadcasters, now joined by a handful of private broadcasters, each one of them owned by one or the other of the Suharto children. Now, this left as an aftermath a whole set of new issues. A national ban on ownership of home satellite receiving systems in Malaysia proved effective in peninsular Malaysia, but ineffective in East Malaysia. East Malaysia is on the island of Borneo. It shares a large border with Indonesia. People in East Malaysia could easily cross those borders, buy those cheap homemade earth stations, and then go back home and put into service those earth stations, and they could receive those satellite signals. So, in response, a domestic satellite provider was authorized, again with ownership aligned to the ruling coalition. Known as ASTRO, Asia System for Television Receiving Organization, today it offers about 26 basic channels plus a wide variety of additional packages such as sports, movies, and news. And important for today's discussion, Al Jazeera English is one of the 6 channels in the news package. Now, because of the multimedia super corridor, officials were forced to accept an open internet policy, or trying to attract foreign direct investment, particularly from American firms, and no one would consider coming to a high-tech reservation if there were filtering of the internet. So the Malaysian government bought into this idea of no filtering of the internet. But that created an opening, and websites independent of government ties arose quickly, notably and most famously Malaysia Kini, which became extremely popular as a source of alternative news. It was particularly popular during the Anwar Ibrahim trial, you know, the trial of the former deputy prime minister who was tried on sodomy and all kinds of outrageous charges. And it was given minimal coverage in conventional media, but people could get full coverage in Malaysia Kini. And at the time, there were more people reading the news on Malaysia Kini on the internet than were receiving copies of that same news in English from the leading English language newspaper, New Straits Times. Efforts to suppress these online newspapers have been only marginally successful. And for now anyway, rearguard action by the government is focusing on bloggers because they have proliferated in huge numbers, and they're provoking the ire of government in a much more important way than the online newspapers. And there are so many more of these citizen journalists available now that they're really having a difficult time maintaining their control of the situation. In Indonesia, a different set of issues arose. In the post-Suharto era, the number of new private television channels grew substantially. In fact, more than the market could support, frankly speaking. Today, TV channels number about 10 or 11. I'm hesitant there because I don't know if that 11th channel is actually on or off the air, and they don't know either. So these channels have been based in Jakarta but are relayed to by satellite to retransmitting facilities across the country. So it's not, even though they're based in Jakarta, they can be seen in the other major cities because they're put on the satellite and then retransmitted by the corporation. Home satellite packagers exist too, including Indosiar and Astro Nusantara, each providing dozens of channels. In their basic packages, Indosiar carries Al Jazeera English, and Astro Nusantara provides Al Jazeera International. But the new broadcasting law of 2002, which is part of a large package of reforms within the government, meant to decentralize government in Indonesia, this is part of that, contains a key provision meant to address complaints of Java-centric media. It required that Jakarta channels form networks based on affiliations with local stations in the outer islands rather than relaying to their own retransmitters. So that's the scheme that was put in place, but this transition was opposed by private Jakarta stations because they'd have to share profits with affiliated stations and cover the costs of networking. So basically they dug in their heels. And when the Jakarta stations balked, they missed a December 2007 deadline, the government postponed the requirement. So we don't know where we are with that requirement at the moment. There are other larger major unresolved issues, and I'll close with these. National unification remains an important need, and the media can play a major role, except that there no longer is a national audience. It is so highly fragmented, there is no single channel that can reach out to the entire population. Technological developments have meant that there has been an openness in the media never before experienced. But we also must face a digital divide, which has meant that the social and regional divisions provide access to those alternative voices in a very unequal fashion. The outer islands have less access to these alternative voices in Indonesia, and the minority communities in Malaysia have much less access to alternative voices too. And of course there is this problem still with language representation, with the wide use of different languages throughout Indonesia and the continuing use of Chinese and Indian as well as English and Malay in Malaysia. We have sharp divisions in populations. And if you look at the audience in the national language on Radio Television Malaysia, its Malay language programs contain 99% of their audience is Malay. Only 1 to 2% of any program from the Chinese has listeners and viewers from the Chinese or the Indian-speaking audiences of Malaysia. So the language continues to divide populations and make it impossible to achieve national unification. There's some other issues, but I think I'll let it go at that, and I'll stop here. We can come to it in the question and answer period if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Drew, for that very solid overview introduction to the issues today. We're going to move on now to our second speaker on this panel. It's Trish Carter, who's currently a freelance journalist based in New Zealand, in Auckland. But she's the former Asia-Pacific Bureau Chief for Al Jazeera English. She was recruited by the company to open its Asia-Pacific Bureau. She then established a 24-hour Kuala Lumpur-based regional news center with bureaus in Sydney, Jakarta, Beijing, and Manila. Before coming to Al Jazeera, Trish held a series of positions with New Zealand media, including head of current affairs and head of news with Television New Zealand, and executive editor and program director at News Talk ZB Radio. She's also served as media center manager with the New Zealand government's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Trish?
Thank you. Distinguished guests, media colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The three big questions that some of the Western media asked me when I was confirmed as Asia Pacific Bureau Chief for Al Jazeera English were, would I have to wear a burqa? Would I have to convert to Islam? And the persistent ones, let's call them the investigative sorts, wanted to know why me? This question always delivered in a suspicious tone. I was in advanced discussions with an Australian headhunter for a media position when I was rung by a former UK colleague. Trish, we are putting together an international team. What about coming on board? It was irresistible. 4 broadcast centres around the world, the promise of fearless reporting, no ratings imperative, and no centralised control. I hesitated twice. The brand was the enfant terrible of the international media world, and the channel at that point was due on air in 6 months' time. But I interviewed and a deal was struck. People were horrified. The headhunters told me doing business with so-called Terror TV was the biggest mistake of my career. I'd be lucky to get work in the future. The channel was riven. It would never get off the ground. Colleagues offered at best qualified support. It was like I had somehow become unpredictable and defective. I left New Zealand on a cold, drizzly winter's afternoon and arrived in Doha 24 hours later. This would be the first of many visits there to hammer out the channel's editorial vision and launch plan with my senior colleagues. What kind of stories would we do? Distinctive coverage, yes, but what did that mean? We agreed we wanted to produce compelling stories through the lives of people everywhere, credible and honest, true to the people reportage, with different perspectives, especially from parts of the world that have been ill-served by others. We wanted to own the premise that news is about the people involved, not about the process or the event itself. To avoid deploying to the revolving doors of the summit or talks because they were an on-the-day diary event. We wanted especially to lose the instinct that if it is somewhere that you know, it is more of a story than somewhere that you don't. We wanted to be the most commanding English language channel on Middle East affairs and the authority on stories from the developing world. But with an estimated 40% of the coverage majoring on the Middle East, what prominence would Asia get? I do not in any way wish to downplay Iraq or that region. It is still the most significant international news story of recent times and the biggest challenge for news organisations and journalists everywhere. But on some days, the more I saw from there on the channel, and we did a lot, the less I somehow knew. But 2 good things happened that settled my concern about the company's commitment to Asia. The Director General of the network, Wada Kamfa, declared that outside of the Middle East, Asia was Al Jazeera English's second most important market. They would say otherwise, but I think this came as a surprise to my senior British colleagues. Veronica stopped giggling. The second thing was the show and tell. We were required to take our pre-cut stories to Doha to present to the senior editorial team. I took our first batch of stories from Beijing, Manila, and Papua New Guinea. It was a brute of a meeting. Some stories were too long, poorly shot, averagely edited, badly structured. I managed it so our material was presented last. We had plenty to work on, but it was clear that the KL Broadcast Centre, along with Africa, had the biggest range of stories to offer, with the type of pictures that breathe life into bulletins. I began to feel confident that in Asia we were on the right track. The channel wanted to be known as the on-the-ground news gatherers. Everyone agreed. If our main focus was to seek out and cover different perspectives of news through grassroots reporting and bring those stories to the Western world, then we would not be doing that consistently, standing on the rooftop of an international hotel or dish site. And if we wanted to be ideas-driven and focused on finding the story at the beginning of the chain, rather than following up at the end, then we needed to believe and act on our rhetoric. The early schedules were developed with this in mind: half our news, half our programs, and then the news hour link-ups all around the world. One of the very big attractions from the correspondent hires was the promise that they could do the kind of work they enjoy: more travel to do more stories and less rooftop reportage. This was a powerful motivator for hiring. James Bays was one of them. This story, which I'm about to run, Michael and Paul, does not come from the KL Broadcast Centre. It aired not long after launch. At that time, it concisely encapsulated the personality of the channel.
Behind Taliban lines, we travelled with a group of fighters across the deserts of Helmand province. These hardened men are well armed, ready for battle, and they told me ready for martyrdom too. The journeys are often at breakneck speed because of the risk of airstrikes. NATO may be the master of the skies, but the Taliban claim on the ground they control large swathes of territory. They took us on a trip to show us how they operate almost unhindered in many areas. They are not just rural areas. This is the town of Sangin. Our camera filmed along the main street past the shopping bazaar. There were Taliban with weapons everywhere, no sign of NATO or Afghan forces. These pictures were filmed from a car occupied by heavily armed Taliban fighters, yet the vehicle can drive straight past the compound housing British troops based in the town. The Taliban claim the British are too scared to even leave their base. The sound of aircraft can be heard, but the fighters are not afraid. They dismissively call the planes Bush's kites. They claim soon they'll be using a new anti-aircraft weapon.
We're not scared of their aircraft. God is with us. We're not scared of anything.
For a time there was confusion about our permission to film. We were detained and our telephones and camera were taken, but we were treated extremely well. Those the Taliban find guilty of a crime are dealt with much more harshly. This is the body of a man hanged by the Taliban. They say he was a spy. He was carrying an ID card from the US Government Development Agency, USAID. We were also shown where NATO bombs have fallen. And when the Taliban took us to a mass rally, clearly arranged for us to film, it was somewhat unnerving standing in the desert with such a large group, over 400 Taliban fighters. There were even youngsters holding weapons. This boy was no more than 12 years old. Here, the ammunition is carried in a UN food bag. The district commander showed me all the land he claims is controlled by his men.
Out of 100%, the British don't even control 1% of Helmand.
He told me the Taliban is not just a military organisation. He said they've appointed a governor in Helmand and are now running medical clinics and madrasas, or religious schools. While we travelled around, there were times when we weren't allowed to film because the Taliban do not want NATO to see pictures of the defences inside their villages.
For 3 days, Al Jazeera have been with Taliban fighters. For much of that time, we've been travelling by road, yet we've seen no Afghan army, no Afghan police and no British soldiers. It's pretty clear to me that large areas of this district are in the control of the Taliban. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Helmand Province, southern Afghanistan.
We assured ourselves that we would not rush down the breaking news mode because that is what others were doing. And there was a bit of summary chest thumping about how live television is all too often about beating the competition than about telling the story properly. all of which is true in theory, and sometimes the channel was as guilty of the malpractice as anyone else. The debates raged fiercely and sometimes heatedly for weeks on the most basic but profound news protocols. What words would we use and what of the ethics of news? How much of the horror of war or famine would we show? There was the technology which was problematic, the style, the format of the half hours, the endless versions of the schedule, the distribution, the merits of centralised control CNN style versus broadcast centre autonomy. I fiercely protected the rights of the KL Broadcast Centre to make its own decisions, but I remain unconvinced that at some future time Al Jazeera English won't take all editorial control back to Doha. Some recruitment was underway. Extensive candidate lists were handed out on that first morning in Doha. Doha, how many on board, how many to find and in what positions. The same for London and Washington. These lists went on for many pages. KL was at the back. It was 1 page long. It was headed up Kuala Lumpur. It had one name confirmed on it, which happened to be mine. It was clear that when the company said start-up, they were not talking green fields. This was more like scorched earth. So little was in place. No one in the room verbalised it that first day, but we were all thinking it. The channel would not be on air in 6 months' time. 3 days later, I left for KL on my new professional life. On my way out of the door to Qatar International Airport, I was given $2,000 US in a plain brown envelope, a stack of CVs that had already been picked over, and a laptop. I quickly discovered that the computer only wrote in Arabic, and when I finally corrected it, it still insisted on writing from right to left. "We'll come out in a few weeks and see how you are going," they said. "Let you get your feet under the desk." Such gallows humour. There was no desk. I was told there was a lease taken on the empty 60th floor of Petronas Tower 2. That was true. But there was no bank account, few official papers, no company registration or permits in a country where nothing happens unless it is in triplicate, few company policies or guidelines, no equipment and no staff. Not a frame or a story had been shot. I had no place to live. There was no temporary office. But I did have a deadline in 6 months. Oh, and by the way, we need bureau in Beijing, Manila and Sydney. Surprisingly to me, Jakarta at that time was not on the list of bureau. Sensibly, it was added later. A project manager, a most colourful character, had been appointed to deal with the Petronas Broadcast Centre fit-out. Asia now numbered 2. I got started on the rest. So why was KL chosen? The decision was driven by operational requirements and cost effectiveness. The company wanted to be central to Southeast Asia and China. Malaysia has a reasonable infrastructure, a comparatively modest cost base, the company was given tax benefits, and by and large Malaysia is English-speaking and is seen as a progressive Islamic society. Critically, the Malaysian government also guaranteed Al Jazeera English editorial independence. This will be tested in the coming months with the recent election results. There are many reasons why television channels focus on financial news in Asia. One of them is that there is less risk of running foul of governments who don't like media freedoms. Financial reporting tends to be more formatted. It frequently deals with absolutes. So there is a breed of journalists who can still do very good work without putting their head too far above the parapet. And you cannot blame them. You can be taken from the streets, have your ID card taken from you, have your families hassled or be imprisoned. Al Jazeera needed a different kind of journalist. They also wanted diversity in race, age and background. It became an interesting balancing act. Initially, KL was to have an all-up staff of 50. That was complete nonsense. By the time I had left, I'd done over 1,000 interviews and had nearly 140 staff on board, with about 15 different ethnicities. Worldwide, Al Jazeera English would have had over 10,000 applications and had hired over 700 staff or thereabouts. There can be problems in newsrooms with journalists from different cultures. That is not unexpected when you consider the many differences in history and origin as well as simple craft issues. But it would be wrong to categorise these issues as mainly television ones. Fundamental to this is the fact that many journalists in mainstream Asia work in a culture of censorship. They are expected, along with their media owners, to nearly always consider the impact their reportage will have on their country and on their government. They see their role in society as being different. I suspect they are privately aghast at the lack of constraint in what they might perceive as recklessness demonstrated by their Western colleagues, who generally have little regard for the effect their reporting can have on society, and who can, of course, move on after their tour of duty ends. During the many interviews I did, candidates were asked to respond to a number of fictional news scenarios. It is a fact that for many of them, their first port of call for any response on any matter, on any story, was to go to the government via their Ministry of Information. They were uncertain what to do or where to go after that. This is not a purely Asian phenomenon. The recent meeting of Arab information ministers that adopted the Cairo Charter of Principles prohibiting criticism of Arab leaders and religious figures is another example. In my own area, the Southwest Pacific, recent events in Fiji also give rise to concern. The Fijian public has been warned about speaking against interim government policies, a newspaper publisher has been expelled, and a report on media freedoms commissioned by the Fiji Human Rights Commission recommends actions at odds with human rights principles. So an expanding media market in Asia and the Pacific will not necessarily guarantee better journalists or better reporting. We know that blogging and citizen journalism is on the rise in Asia as it is elsewhere in the world. Some of these serious writers have increasing online influence, provoking and pushing governments. They have a role in reporting conflicts or humanitarian issues and do so with courage and commitment. They have few advocacy groups to safeguard their interests, and they are vulnerable in communities where there is fear of the consequences for speaking out. I would like to think the arrival of Al Jazeera English in Asia has helped them and other media, at least morally. When an international channel is bearing witness to an event, it is more difficult for governments to deny, spin, obfuscate and tailor their news on their government-sponsored channels. It won't stop them, but it does become more difficult. Viewing Al Jazeera's coverage of the protests on the streets of Kuala Lumpur last year, I find it extraordinary that the Malaysian government was so surprised by March's election result. None of the people in the footage that day would have been. The Indonesian government became a bit fed up with us during the Jakarta floods of 2006 with our sustained coverage of the event. It was a story that normally makes about 5 sentences on the international pages. Another flood in Asia, a few more dead. This is a good story, but a very basic one, to show that sometimes the stories don't have to be controversial to have an impact. We'd done about 6 or 7 of these reports over a period of about 3 days, plus lives, analysis experts, etc. Word came to us via our correspondent, Step Vassen, that the government wouldn't mind a break from the sustained coverage, if we could roll that track.
Evacuated, also some sick people. It all took too long. Soldiers said they couldn't enter the neighborhood because of the strong currents, but now, thank God, 90% of those people have been rescued.
Bisa kemarin dievakuasi, tapi alhamdulillah mungkin 90% warga sudah dievakuasi.
Only a few still need help to leave their flooded house, but others are still required to make sure that aid can arrive safely. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, Jakarta.
For some reason, that didn't come in at the start of the track, but it was a very just basic story about flooding, but it did contain some criticism. It did contain some criticism from people who have been rescued, very mild criticism at that, but it started to upset the Indonesians, and that's when word came to us. I never got used to the direct way that government officials or authority figures in Asia would assume that they would be advised on any editorial matter that might upset the government well before it went to air, and their look of genuine puzzlement, surprise and hurt when you said this simply would not happen. Media companies in 2008 are more profit-obsessed and are confronting a more volatile, competitive environment than ever before. I don't think there's anything new in that. Even if they were moved by more traditional journalistic values, the pressure remains constantly on editors to make their output what the marketers refer to as news that you can use. Not surprisingly, considering many of us had formerly worked for commercial broadcasters, some of the more vociferous arguments early on at Al Jazeera English were reserved for discretionary stories. The Oscars, the celebrity adoption stories, the McCartney-Mills divorce, then in its early throes, later the Madeleine McCann story, the coupling sneezing or scratching pandas at the end of every bulletin. Thankfully, there was a majority view, and it was the right one. It is a market well taken care of. There are plenty of critics who believe Al Jazeera English is unrelentingly grim and offers no light and shade. To them, I say good. On some days, the channel can be a hard watch. But when I look ahead, I believe that quality news services will be more important than ever. They will provide the understanding and coherence on all manners of issues that will help me form my worldview. I don't expect the latest Brittany, Paris, Brittany, Amy tattle, or the equivalent of National Geographic on Al Jazeera, and I don't expect Billboard or Hello magazine will be running a treatise on the six-party talks anytime soon. All media companies are difficult, but Al Jazeera English is a tough company. Some things I disliked. Being a Western white Christian woman in an Arab company is not easy. There is rivalry between the various divisions of the company, mainly about power and influence, but rarely were there issues in Asia about editorial. I would not say that Al Jazeera English is editorially fearless, but it comes close to it. It can because it has no worry with ratings. They are simply never discussed. It accepts some advertising, though not enough to be self-sufficient. These factors make it unafraid to challenge the established voice, and I cannot tell you as a Western journalist how good that feels. After all, how you see news depends on where you are standing. In the same week, Donald Rumsfeld accused Jazeera Arabic of being pro-Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Iraq accused it of being a tool of the Americans. Recently, Al-Qaeda issued a fatwa against Al Jazeera English. They were unhappy with the treatment given to one of bin Laden's recent statements. Being funded by oil and gas does not mean there are unlimited dollars to burn on stories. Certainly, the company does not have the same commercial pressures, but the budgets are fixed and stay that way. With some exceptions, the company sits towards the mid and bottom end of the global pay scale. There are strict accountabilities which are rigorously enforced. It didn't take 7 months before the channel went on air. It took over double that. It was rare to have a day that was anything less than chaotic, and now it is reported to be available in 100 million homes in over 60 countries. The obstacles and difficulties during that time were many and varied and still represent significant challenges for the company. Some of these go back to the original basis on which the channel was founded. The HR policies that were never quite formed, the operating funds that were frequently late, contractual issues that were never quite sorted out, clarity over direction, sibling channel rivalry. Add in cultural differences and you have a potent mix. I was trying to think of a typical day as Bureau Chief to convey to you any sense of the sublime and the ridiculous during those first 2 years. Apart from the editorial pursuits, the continual worry of having teams on the ground in places where journalists are regarded as targets, the endless technical detail, the tap-dancing diplomacy with governments and other broadcasters, what seemed like 3/4 of the staff who got dengue fever all at once, the pure unadulterated rush that was launch day, etc., there were plenty of other things to keep me busy. The double ring around the world cable on which our whole technology was based, which lay in the main shipping lanes of Asia, was repeatedly dragged by ships' anchors, severing it. At times this rendered us inoperable and cut off from the rest of the world. Particular and quite exceptional detail about the Emir's room. This was designed by a New York architect. I was told that I must have it in case he visited one day. The ceiling had been fitted out like a Bedouin's tent, with twinkling stars to resemble the Qatari night sky. That ceiling was up and down 3 times that I know of because there weren't quite enough stars. The Emir, to my knowledge, has not yet dropped by. I sure hope that he does. The fire drills and Patronus that made you realise that if anything happened in those towers, you would be lucky to get out unscathed. It is a beautiful but eccentric place for a newsroom. The senior Thai military intelligence unit who arrived one day thinking they would take photos of my technical fit-out and that would somehow be okay. And then there was that French Spider-Man who climbs tall buildings around the world. He decided out of all the offices in the whole of the Patronus Twin Towers that he would enter mine one day, having climbed from the bottom, as security burst into my office, guns at the ready to haul him off. Much has been written about the indifference of the public to international news. That politicians, big business, influencers of every kind form the small informed nucleus that have access to the elite sources of information they require, relying in essence on a compliant and complacent public. My experience in Asia Pacific, where almost universally our cameras and correspondents were welcomed, is that people want their stories to be told. It is clear that information, when impartially and credibly conveyed, can impact the public viewpoint and decision makers. At its zenith, it can help shape foreign policy. That is its allure and also its menace. Al Jazeera English has helped reverse the flow of information from the east to the west. Anecdotally, it seems to have been well received in Asia. It has certainly been well received in my own country, New Zealand. On launch day, I remember looking up at the bank of screens while trying to deploy a team to a suspected tsunami in Japan. CNN was on a US domestic story, the BBC was on the opening of Parliament, and Al Jazeera English was talking to a rebel leader in Darfur. None of these story choices were wrong, but with the advent of this channel, you are now more likely to see Darfur on CNN and the BBC than you will ever see the opening of Parliament on Al Jazeera English. That might suggest to me that if news was simply retail, then Al Jazeera English has been very good for business. I'd like to thank the team at the Wilson Centre for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to your questions later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trish. That was very insightful. Well, we're going to take questions now. Our third speaker is not present, so we're going to go to questions and answers. And before we start that, because we're webcasting, please wait for the microphone to arrive before you ask a question. And please start by giving your name and affiliation. And finally, please keep your question brief. And we do prefer questions. So, show of hands. Yes, the first one will be all the way in the back.
I'm Raghuveer Goyal from India Globe in Asia Today. My question is that most of the Osama bin tapes were aired by Al Jazeera, and somebody must be knowing in Al Jazeera that where the tapes came from and who delivers them, and we still don't know. And I'm sure somebody may be knowing in Al Jazeera where is Osama bin Laden.
Me?
It's you.
The bin Laden tapes. What I know of them is that when they first started to appear on Arabic, I think that they arrived by a series of complicated drops. Very few people were in the know on that. These days, you won't be surprised to learn that I think they're uplinked by an internet cafe somewhere. So there's nothing great or romantic about how, in actual fact, they get into the hands of the Al Jazeera channel. From there, I think they go to an editorial conference. Not all of the tapes are aired. Frequently, they are not. And of course, I think there's a great deal of hypocrisy, really, between the channels on this whole business of the bin Laden tapes. I don't think anyone would think that if they got into the hands of the BBC initially or CNN, in fact, I think one of them went to Reuters first quite recently. Al Jazeera doesn't always get them first. But I think there's quite a lot of double talk from the media about it. Of course, if you get a tape from bin Laden, you're going to look at it and assess it on its news value. So I'm afraid I can't be any more specific about how the tapes arrive. But yeah, these days they're uplinked via an internet cafe.
Okay, next question. Yes, Samia.
My name is Samia. I'm a Pakistan scholar at the Wilson Centre. And this question is for either of the panelists, and I'd appreciate both of them to comment on that. Trish, you said, and it resonates with me, you said news is about people involved. And I see the footage that you showed, very brave of the reporter to go with just being in a vehicle like that is courageous enough, but to spend time with them. My question is a little bit larger. When you do say that news is about people involved, but the news is presented on most of the channels in bits and pieces most of the time. And for a common man or woman in the street who's trying to understand what the issues are from these bits and pieces, it's very difficult. So what is the responsibility of the media in such a fashion? I understand that it's a company and companies are set up to operate as companies and make a profit and, be responsible to the shareholders, but it seems like a kind of a paradoxical situation.
Go ahead.
Well, I agree with you. I think that it is actually quite difficult to, in actual fact, seek out the news and information that you want to get these days. I mean, I'm a professional, I enjoy doing it, and I have a range of suppliers that I follow to get my worldview. I think, certainly in terms of Al Jazeera English, I think it's one of the reasons why the format for me worked quite well. They decided quite early on that they weren't going to go down the rolling news scenario all that often, that they would stick to their half-hour format. So it's half hour of news and half hour of programs at the back. Now the idea is that if something significant happens, something big that really warrants it, you know, when we were in Myanmar, for example, we decided that the material that we got from there was of such good significance that we would put together a half-hour program that would run at the back of the half-hour news, so that for those people that wanted context or more information, they could get it that way. I like the format personally. That being the case, they'll probably change it. Because I think in that half hour, you know, you're not distracted by too much live reporting, too much cutaway, too much going to the live press conference, etc., where you only have a certain amount of time and you want to be able to focus in on what's going on. But I agree with you. It is quite difficult, and the media does still and should always have a responsibility to context and to provide analysis in a way that people can understand it and be relevant to them. Drew?
Actually, the question you ask, of course, is one of the most vexing problems in journalism. Especially, it's a problem for electronic media, which focuses on the visible by its very nature. And it's compounded, the difficulty is compounded by the emphasis on hard news and meeting deadlines. This forces media outlets to focus on what's happening this instant, rather than thinking about how this instant's events fit into a larger context. I think we've gotten worse at this, frankly, over the years. I'm thinking particularly of the issue on follow-up stories. How often do you see a story in which there is some really remarkable event reported at an early stage, and 2, 3 weeks, maybe months later, you don't have closure on that story? I'm afraid the media have become very much forced by the nature of what they do today to pay less attention to this larger contextual frame. And maybe it's not really the role of electronic media to fill that responsibility. Maybe that's the role of print media, where time is not of the essence, where you might have the space to do an expansive story. But it certainly is something that troubles me as one who works in the media, and so it's not really an answer, but I guess I'm commiserating with you as a concern.
I think the International Herald Tribune, I think, have made a really good effort to try and provide context via people. If you have a look at some editions are better than others, but they will really try and take an issue and think, okay, how does that relate to people? So they'll go to the village or the silk trail or the rice field or whatever, and they will really try and distill down for you that kind of information. And that's one publication that I can see has really tried to make an adjustment. But he's right, it's difficult.
Okay, take a question in the front here.
Question: what effort is made to create a potential roundtable discussion of issues? I know this sounds idealistic at first glance, but we who follow the newspaper wonder, what is the motivation of the Taliban? What is the interest they have of these soldiers going to the field with missiles and such? What do they perceive the enemy to be? And I'm just wondering to what degree there can be in-depth reporting, and then hopefully with this huge chasm between East and West, somebody to sit at a table in an almost Quaker meeting setting and say, well, this is what it's about. Now, this question may sound crazy at first blush, but I think in terms of what media can do to make a better world, it may have some relevance.
That item that I showed you, I think, was around about 3 minutes 8 long. It was part, I think, in the end of at least a half-hour program that was made. The background to that is that James disappeared from sight, basically, and there were grave fears beginning to be held for his safety. You know, I think the company was at the stage where they were thinking that his family might need to be notified, etc. And up he popped. He rang, checked in, because you have a series of checks when you're dealing with an organisation like the Taliban, obviously, where you have to check in at a certain number of hours so that the company back home knows that you're safe and that everything is as it should be. He checked in, he had some great stuff. That was only a small part of an overall piece that was done that received a great deal of coverage, and I think there were certainly panel discussions off the back of that. I don't think the panel discussions involved the Taliban as such, but certainly did involve Taliban experts in analysis. So I think that is something that this company tries to do, probably doesn't always succeed. I think it's something that media companies do try to do a little bit more and are doing a little bit more. I think there is a craving for context and analysis. I agree with you there. And sometimes a 3-minute item just doesn't do it for you. You know, it provides more questions than answers.
Actually, let's go here, right in the front.
Okay, my name is Joe Saadi, and I'm from Radio Sawa. Two questions related. What do you think that Al Jazeera English added to the editorial policy of the main Al Jazeera in Arabic, or had it adopted the same editorial policy? And number two, you told us why did you join, and that it was irresistible for you at the very beginning for both, mainly for professional reasons. But again, why did you leave? Was it motivated by professional reasons?
I'll deal with the easy answer first. I left after after 2 and a bit years. It provided me with the most. It is the hardest job I've ever done. I'm regarded as someone who is no slouch. I'm a hard worker, I'll get stuck in, but this was at a level that was beyond probably anything I think that any of us, I see some Al Jazeera colleagues in the room here, had experienced before, because so little had been set up. So you would work, I would easily work 7 days a week. I would normally do 6. I would easily do 16 or 17 hours a day, because you had to cover London time as well as time in the States as well as time in the Middle East. So after 2 and a bit years, I was tired, I think. And also, on a more personal reason, I have a husband, and we were commuting at that stage, and after 2 and a bit years or so, we decided that, we wanted to be back together again for a little. Husbands are like that. I don't know if you know that, but they're kind of quite keen. So really, my issues were more personal to me. I think what you were saying is, is the company riven with, difficulties with editorial and things, and were there more professional reasons why I decided to go? Not for me, no, but I alluded there to some of the issues that the company does have, and there is no doubt that the company is going through some very interesting growing pains that they're going to need to get on top of, or go through some new stage. It's been they haven't been on air very long, but they've had quite a lot has happened during the period of time they've been on air. As for what we added, I think Veronica really should probably talk to this later on in her dissertation. But I think that we probably added quite a lot to one another. I think we got as much from the Arabic as they got from us. There is no doubt that there are some. One of the great things is that you can sit next to your Pakistani colleague or your Indian colleague or your Middle Eastern colleague and find that although you've never met before, that in actual fact there is. Everybody thinks the same. This is a story. Most things are. You believe the same thing, but you may differ in the way that you get there. And so from that point of view, I think that we have learned a great deal from one another. Not all of that has been easy learning. Some of it has been quite difficult. You know, culture alone would suggest that things are quite different. The way that I might choose to go down a story may be different from the way an Australian colleague might, and will certainly be different from the way that an Asian journalist will. And then there's the Middle East. So yeah, it's learning together, but some of it's not been all that great.
There's a question right here in the middle.
Hello, I'm Susan Gillian from Intermediate Survey Institute. Another question for Trish. You mentioned how wonderful it is how wonderful it was not to have to deal with ratings. But could you share, how did you know what resonated with your viewers, and how did you know how well you were doing without ratings?
Well, we didn't, because there were no ratings. There was nothing that said, you know, we didn't get the piece of paper every day that you get when you are ratings driven. You know, it's like you cram for an exam and then the next day you look at the ratings to see whether or not you've passed or not. I always felt it was a bit like that with ratings. We didn't. It wasn't something that initially concerned us, to be honest with you. We got to where in about 14 months, you know, from the 6-7 months that they thought it was going to take us. To do that, I think, was absolutely going for it. It was such a relief to get out the door, to shoot some stories, to get some stuff in the can, to get a format in place, to get the technology sorted out and to get on air, that in actual fact it didn't bother us particularly that we had no ratings. We certainly had a lot of feedback from the public. We certainly had plenty of feedback from government ministries at various times who were quick to indicate to us whether they thought that we had passed their test or not. So it was anecdotal at the very best. Certainly, and I think at this stage, you know, it would be great to get some better measure than that, and I think there is someone going to be talking about that later on in the panel. But no, we didn't, and, you know, it was so frantic that it wasn't such a big worry. But, you know, out of all that good work, you would like to think someone was watching, certainly.
Okay, question right here.
Yes, I'm Millage Walker from American University, and I'd like to address this question to Drew. Singapore is often labeled somewhat superficially as an irritant both to Malaysia and Indonesia, perhaps because it modernized more quickly and because it's considered to be somewhat more cosmopolitan than either of the other countries. To what extent have the experience of Singapore had on the development of the media in both the two major countries?
Well, Singapore and Malaysia were actually united. Singapore was part of Malaysia between 1963 and 65. And when Singapore left Malaysia, you get a different story. In Singapore, they say we were tossed out of Malaysia. In Malaysia, they say Singapore withdrew from Malaysia. In any case, the two were joined, and the media were joined actually from the colonial period onward. Radio Television Malaysia was once part of what became Radio Singapore. And so the media share the same roots and much of the same history and many of the same policies. Of course, they've gone very different directions now. And that's true, by the way, of print media as well as electronic media. In Kuala Lumpur, you have the New Straits Times, and in Singapore, you have the Straits Times. They were once the one and the same newspaper, but they've gone in different directions. This is emblematic, really, of many things in Singapore and Malaysia. There is a kind of love-hate relationship that forms, as you might, between any two siblings. And I think you see this play out in many different ways, and certainly it plays out in the media. Indonesia is a bit different because it's not part of that Singapore Malaysia mix. Singapore is probably an irritant to all of the other countries in ASEAN, and it's because Singapore pursues a policy, its foreign policy is much more unilateralist than the other countries of ASEAN. And I think if you characterize that as being something of an irritant, that would be the origin of that, I would say.
Yes, question.
This question is for Trish. I know you're out of the company now, but I was wondering if you had any updates as to the possibility of Al Jazeera in English being on any of the American cable providers, and if you knew if the reasons why it currently is not, or is it political pressure, or is it senior executives making assumptions that it would be amazingly unpopular, or and have they done any surveys to see if people are curious to see, you know, this channel, which was vilified by Rumsfeld and everybody for so long, just to hear it in a language they understand? Or if you have any predictions or any updates.
You know, I don't, and I don't like to fudge that question at all. But I noticed that my colleague Will Stebbins, with the red tie, who is the bureau chief for Washington, is in the audience here today, and I'm hoping that Will might be able to update you on the latest in relation to that. But while he's gathering his thoughts to do that, can I say it's such a shame that it's not in the States, and it drives me nuts that it's not even in Australia. You know, both big markets that, you know, if New Zealand can get it, for goodness sake, you know, I love my country, it's fantastic, but it's 4 million people, and, you know, the sky has not fallen in Chicken Licken because Al Jazeera English has arrived in New Zealand. I found it interesting. The Australian correspondent for Al Jazeera was in New Zealand recently for a story, and it was a big public story. There was someone had died, and it was a massive outpouring of grief, etc. And I caught up with him that evening, and he was aghast. He said, "Trish, you know, I had to talk. I went along the line of mourners, and people said to me, you know, where are you from?" And he said, "Oh, you know, here we go. Have to explain. I'm from Al Jazeera." And he said, not only did people know about it, but they said that they watched it and that they quite liked it. And he found this somewhat curious. This had never, ever happened to him before. You know, it's another consumer choice, as I see it. It doesn't mean that you support the channel or support what it says, or, you know, that you take a viewpoint. It's another consumer choice that people should be able to have. I know that may be a simplistic view, but that is my view. And the fact that it's not in Australia and it's not in the States is a shame. And I just really hope that at some stage that does change. Well, you might have an update. Do you?
Did you want to...
Well, appropriate forum, but we're still negotiating. We clearly one common response from cable systems owner is that there is no interest in international news in the U.S. and we certainly know there is an audience here. 80% of the visitors to the English language website are U.S. based, so most of the traffic that comes to the English language website is U.S. based. So there's clearly an appetite in the U.S. for international news, and it always seems a paradoxical statement when, you know, rarely in contemporary history has the U.S. been so engaged overseas, and that it's critical right now for for Americans in particular to have a credible source of international news and a diverse range of international news. But, you know, we're not the only ones struggling for carriage in the U.S. The BBC has struggled for carriage in the U.S. for years. CNN International is not available in the U.S. You have to live overseas to see CNN International. The only version of CNN that you can see in the U.S. is CNN Domestic. So, you know, there is that context in which we're operating, and one cannot discount the legacy of the Iraq and Afghan campaigns. Al Jazeera was clearly identified as a strategic issue, and there was a concerted attempt to delegitimize Al Jazeera because they were giving a radically different account of events on the ground than was being promoted in Washington, and so it's a combination of the two. But we are available on the internet, and we we are in the sort of the vanguard of internet distribution, purely by accident, not by design, and we continue to negotiate for carriage. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder here. This is about Asia, not.
It's always about the States, Will.
Okay, next question. Oh, Veronica? Yes, right in the front.
Hi, I noticed in Drew, your paper, your presentation, you talked about Al Jazeera English being available on one system and Al Jazeera International being available on another. And can you clarify what you mean by that? Because for those of us who work with Al Jazeera, we do notice that people are not clear about what the structure of the company is, and I think that I think that there is some confusion also there, because we used to be called Al Jazeera International, and now we are Al Jazeera English. As far as I know,
Right.
there isn't a channel in the network that's called.
Okay, I'm just reporting to you what these broadcasting organizations put on their own website. So this is what they say. I don't know what it means. Yeah.
So if you don't mind, Michael, can I take the opportunity to say that Al Jazeera Network has within it, is a kind of umbrella organization for 7 channels. I can't actually even name all of them. Al Jazeera English, Al Jazeera Arabic, which
Documentary, children's.
Documentary,
Sport,
children's, sports, Mubasha. That's it? Yeah, okay. There we are. So it's not just Al Jazeera English that's out there, just so that you know there's a lot of content.
Good clarification. Next question. I thought I saw something in the back, but maybe not. Sure. No, another. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back a little bit to my original question. I don't mean to sound argumentative, but I'm thinking of the responsibility of the storyteller. Going back to, don't want to put you on the spot either, Tish, but the responsibility of the storyteller. You are telling a story, and if I'm seeing and listening to the story that was told, somebody like me is going to say, well, so what's going on? Here is this ragtag band of people, who are ill-equipped, ill-dressed, ill-fed, whatever, and they have control over 99% of this area. Where are our guys? My tax dollar is going to buy equipment for those people and house them and send them over there, and so what's going on? So isn't that the responsibility also of the storyteller who's telling the story to at least give me that information?
And yes, it is, although the storyteller will also have a news desk and a whole heap of editors and all the rest of it above him saying, you've got 3 minutes for this story, or you've got 3 minutes 30, or you've got 4 minutes, or whatever it is, and you've got to, jam it in. So I think it's then over to the company to create the vehicle to enable the sort of analysis that you might require. To be fair to James, that was just a 3-minute item that I had. There were, I think, 3 or 4 other versions, all of them longer, and there was a half-hour special on that very story that would have answered a lot of those questions for you. And it would have happened probably, I think the coverage would have run out probably over a week. So you would have had opportunity to, in actual fact, get some of those answers. I've got no doubt about that. One of the things I think which is good about Al Jazeera English is that there is no prescribed length for a news item. It varies from day to day, of course it does, because you've got certain things that you need to get into a bulletin. But if someone came to you and said, look, the story is worth 4 minutes or whatever, you would cut it to that and you would have a look at it. And if someone else said, look, it's worth 2 minutes 15, what I've got, the durations varied, which I think was really very good. Because most news items on electronic media today do tend to be shorter to fit the news that you can use category that the marketers want people to to have. So yes, I think in James's piece you would have in actual fact received the context, and I apologise if it looks as if it was skirting over things lightly. We only had a certain amount of time today, and so I needed to jam pack as much in as I needed to be able to convey the point. Does that answer the question? It is a dilemma, as Drew says.
Partly yes, but See, the thing is that then where does the buck stop? I understand that this is the amount of time that is given to you for news. It's 2 minutes or 3 minutes, but the purpose of this company is.
How much would you like? How much do you need?
I would no. What I'm moving towards is that is there now an opportunity, as somebody said, that U.S. and the West is engaged very much in the developing countries. So there needs to be information brought to the U.S. and the British taxpayer in terms of what's happening with their tax dollar outside, and how do they get that information. I'm asking you that is there an opportunity now for people like you, clearly who have the experience, who have been in the trenches, who've been on the ground, to bring that information back to your company higher ups to say that, well, maybe it kind of bumps up against their stock options or whatever, and whatever. But is there an opportunity at this time for some regulations or some policies to change? And to me it seems that somebody like you would be in a very strong position to make those recommendations, I hope.
I doubt that very much, actually, but I think. Oh, Veronica, help me out here. The thing is that I can go back and thunder to anyone I want and say we need to do X, Y, Z, and the other. But Al Jazeera English is one of those unusual beasts. It doesn't have a ratings imperative, and it can do, to some degree, does what it wants in terms of news. If you go to CNN or BBC or anything in Australia, New Zealand, etc., there are prescriptions. It is prescribed. And so that's, I could thunder about that for all I was worth, and they'd say, yes, Trish, that's very nice, but people are not interested in international news. Now, you may well be the difference, and that's lovely and that's fantastic. But by and large, I can tell you as a commercial broadcaster, if you put too much international news on, you won't rate. And therefore, you don't rate, you don't make money. Veronica, with her CNN experience, will be able to tell you exactly how that works. I think the other thing also is that there is a responsibility on consumers. Certainly not an equal responsibility. I accept the media really do need to be doing more in this regard. But there is a responsibility on consumers to seek out the information. If I don't feel I'm getting what I want from this supplier, I will simply go and seek what I want elsewhere. And thank God for the internet in terms of that, because that's exactly what I will do to get my questions answered. Veronica?
I suppose I'm at more liberty. I have more of a license to trumpet the Al Jazeera brand. So if I can kind of address your question by going actually back to the answer to your question earlier about North America distribution. If you'd been able to see that package by James Bay's roll out at the time, you would have seen that actually, how could you forget Afghanistan Week?
Yeah.
We did a whole week of Afghanistan coverage. Trish mentioned 3 or 4 reports that James did and undertook considerable risk to life and limb in order to obtain. But we also were live and speaking to aid workers, government officials, spokespeople from the US who are actually very helpful to us in giving balance and perspective to the stories that we're doing, and people in London,
But if you don't get Al Jazeera...
But if you don't get Al Jazeera, then you won't know. So please, join the merry band of 80% of website users from the United States.
Can I get into this too? It seems to me that we can't expect a single channel to service all news functions that we might wish. We've already discussed the great strength of a visual story being told in a very powerful way in this report. But it can't give us facts and figures of the sort that you might want to buttress a story like this. You'd prefer to go to a different medium entirely to receive that kind of information. And I think we can't expect a television news channel to provide us our full menu of different information options. And I think you're quite right. We have an obligation ourselves as consumers to make intelligent use of the different information sources available to us in order to get what you call the big picture.
It's not one size fits all.
Okay, why don't we take a question here, Sean?
This is also for Trish. One of the strengths I think that's been that really draws some people to Al Jazeera English is the rotating bureau structure, where Kuala Lumpur is in charge of broadcasting for a certain amount of time, Doha, London, and then Washington. I was wondering if you could comment on some of the strengths and weaknesses of such an approach, because it is quite unique. And I'm going to warn you that the reason why I'm asking is if it is really kind of evolutionary, is there anyone advocating more bureaus to be rotated to, an increase in the number of bureaus? Because it seems like that is kind of the selling point for Al Jazeera English, providing a local perspective on international news.
One of the things I really liked about this channel was the fact that they were quite prepared to go into a location and open a bureau, temporary bureau, for 18 months and then close it and move on. And I think that's really quite sensible. You know, some stories will have a life, and that life may well be, 12 months, 6 months, 18 months. And you don't want to set up, there forever, but you do want to set up there and have an infrastructure for the life of the story. And I think that's really sensible, and I think it's good use of resources. Broadcast centre autonomy, I think it's going to be a movable feast with this channel. It's my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company. Here's the disclaimer. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company, and I have no inside knowledge. But it was a battle every day and every week, and I haven't spoken to Will, but I can guarantee that he will still be having the same battles now as we did all those months ago. When you have something called head office, they tend to want to be able to control things. It's like it's hardwired into the DNA. And so you had to fight, I think, quite often, every day, on stories that you felt should be higher up the order, higher up Doha's order as well as your own, and that you felt on some days should lead. I mean, every day you would lead with a Middle East story. Now, as I said, I'm not downplaying the Middle East. It is the story of our recent times. But some days, there were stories out of Asia where you thought, gee, we could actually lead with that today, and not necessarily lead on, Hamas, Hezbollah yet again. That's my view. I think that bit by bit, Doha will try and continue to bring editorial control back, because that's kind of the way that they're going to be. That's the way that most of the journalists there have operated. They've operated under a central kind of a control. I think the great advantage, though, is that editorially you can make your own decisions, and we did that in Asia a lot, and I'm sure that they do this in the States still. Where if we want to deploy somewhere, we think that there is a story of significance somewhere, then we just go and do it. We don't need to reference it back necessarily unless there are issues of security or larger than usual money. You don't have to reference it back to Doha. It comes up via their planning system, it's in the system, and away you go and do it. That's just fantastic. You don't need to clear scripts out of Doha unless, again, it is something of some sensitive nature. It's all done locally. It's edited locally. You don't need to show it to Doha before it goes to where, again, unless there's some sensitivity related to it. I just think it's very good. It allows you to get some real expertise and some real momentum going, and to do follow-ups and all the rest of it in your own patch, which I think is pretty important. Does that answer it?
There's a question in the back. Why don't we take questions from people who haven't asked that, and then we can go back to those who have. So right in the back.
This question is for Drew. My name is Sabin Hinton. I'm from the Department of State. I work in public diplomacy there. My question is, you mentioned about the low-power frequency radio stations in Indonesia and how they weren't, that these days they weren't that significant. But I wanted you to go back historically and think about when these political parties, when these large Muslim groups were forming under the repressive regime of Suharto, did they use the radio as sort of a means of local communication dialogue? How that evolved in the recent decades with the formation of the internet? And I don't know if you've heard of the news story that's been circulating recently about a Malaysia telecom company is going to be installing a $14 billion project into Indonesian mosques, a large broadband infrastructure, and how that's going to affect local dissemination of information and community dialogue.
First, the local radio stations. The local radio stations under Suharto law were prohibited from running news, carrying news. And as I suggested, they were all required to carry newscasts from the national broadcaster 6 times a day. Now, what many of the more professional of the local stations did was they didn't label it news. They called it current information or something of the sort. And they disguised their news by giving it another name. And in fact, they ran those local stories. But that was the product of, it took a considerable effort to do that. And most of these stations were restricted by the coverage areas they were allowed to serve. They were restricted because they couldn't earn enough money to generate enough income to develop a newsroom of any size. The only stations that overcame that were those that were aligned with Compass, for example, or other major newspapers. And they developed major undertakings. I'm not aware of any of the, but there may have been some. I'm not aware of any of the Islamist groups that took over any of the local radio stations. Certainly, if we look to other parts of Asia, for example, in the northwest frontier territories in Pakistan, you would find a lot of community radio stations that are on the air operated by the Taliban there. And it's possible that there were, I suppose, at an earlier time, maybe prototypes of that in Indonesia, but I'm not aware that that was the case. Now, as far as the Internet's concerned, it's the Internet for sure has been a liberating force in Indonesia. Some people have argued, in fact, that the downfall of Suharto was triggered by online groups that were able to mobilize their forces and coordinate their action nationwide by their online presence. And so any furtherance of this online presence is only going to lead to a greater democratization of the media. Now, that includes, of course, when we talk of democratization, it will mean that everybody, including the Islamist groups, will get greater access to online sources too. But I don't think we should be afraid of that in Indonesia, frankly. That's my opinion.
Are there any other questions? Oh, okay, yes, right back here in the front.
I've come today because my field is totally different, so I'm tabula rasa. First of all, I wanted to know who finances Al Jazeera? Who's behind it? My concern is this. I remember when Mr. Khrushchev banged his shoe on the table and he said, "We will bury you." And I get the general feeling that the financial backers might be people interested in affecting the Western way of life, to be euphemistic. So I'm concerned whether there is, what's the financial power, what does Al Jazeera mean, what is its credo, and really where the money's coming from.
It's funded by the Emir. Simply,
the Emir of?
Qatar.
Okay. But does he get additional funding from other Muslim sources?
Not that I'm aware of. You know, it's funded by oil and gas, isn't it, really, from that big hole in the ground. And it operates under a charter similar to the BBC, similar.
But is it propagandistic? Is it fair to say it has a major message? I mean, just as bad as maybe the O'Reilly show may be over here, is it over here the other way?
Does it have an attitude?
Yes.
Veronica, what do you think?
I'll be talking, sorry, a little bit later I'll be talking at more length about the editorial agenda of Al Jazeera, but you reminded me about a conversation that I had in your answer to the ratings question that I had with the bosses at Al Jazeera when I first joined. I was with CNN for 10 years and I was with the BBC for 2.5 years. That's my experience in journalism, as well as a Philippine broadcaster very early on. And I asked them, if there's not going to be ratings, if there's not going to be ad sales, what is going to be the measure of the success of this channel? And they said, high quality journalism.
I think that's an ad hominem answer. I'm not comfortable with that.
I think that, to be honest with you, that is what we've gone on we've wanted to do. And you talk about the Emir of Qatar, the Qatari government. The United States has its biggest military base outside of the United States in Qatar. CENTCOM is in Qatar.
I think I don't know that you're going to be persuaded by anything I have to say, but I'll give it a go. And here's just my personal experience. I am not aware of any time over the 2 and a bit years that I was at Al Jazeera where I was aware of any program interference in any stories I did in Asia, except for once, where I received a call from an Arab editorial figure on the news desk, concerned that I was showing a shot of a Hindu festival in India where the men were naked. And he wasn't all that keen on the naked image of men jumping into the Ganges. And I ignored that because it was nonsense. So that was fine. There was no one telling me what attitude I should have to Asia. There was no one telling me about the stories that I could or couldn't do, or taking out script lines, or changing images or shots or anything of that nature. There were stories that were sensitive. Apostasy stories was I think, one of them. I think there's a sensitivity for the channel. And some stories were sent up on those sensitive issues to view. If there was any concern about any of the content, then there'll be a discussion. Now, you don't know me and I don't know you, but I can say to you that generally speaking, if it got to my level, you would have to persuade me pretty big time to take anything out that I was certain should be in a story. I wouldn't hesitate to flout. If I felt that things didn't go my way and I felt that there were no good reasons for doing so, then the story would run irrespective. Now, I never got myself in that position. But there was no interference as such. Why does the Emir do it? I don't know. I've never met the Emir. We've never had a conversation. But one of the reasons is I don't think anybody knew too much about Qatar, I think, or Doha, before Al Jazeera came along. And I think that apart from anything else, it's been a huge marketing opportunity for that country. It really has put the Middle East on the map in terms of what Doha and Qatar are doing. They see that as an opportunity, and it is an opportunity. And I think that could be one of the reasons. If you're suggesting that there are dark forces which are aligned to bring a pro-Islam thing to the West, I can't comment on that. That is not something that I felt. Some days I felt some stories were weighted far too much to the Middle East, and I've said that already. That's my personal viewpoint. But in terms of dark forces interfering in editorial, I can tell you, hand on heart, that did not happen while I was there, and I don't think it will be happening now. It's such a big thing for journalists, that. And I mean, bearing in mind that when a lot of us came on board, we were quite cynical about the whole thing, because you've heard this before, fearless journalism, we won't do this, we won't do that. We've all been in the media business for years. And a lot of these people that came on board early on were Americans and British journalists. And we were looking under rocks and stones and crannies of every kind to see where this interference was going to be. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. I hope it doesn't ever happen, because the channel doesn't need that. I don't know you're going to be satisfied, but it's been my experience. Okay, I'm sorry that the best shot probably wasn't good enough.
Okay, looks like we could take one more question. So, yes.
Hi, I'm Rose Chan. You just brought up a very interesting aspect. Can you say the same thing about the other subsidiary within the network? This Arab, with the hiring and the editorial freedom, the diversity point of view.
Okay, I can't comment about the Arabic. And I'm sorry if that sounds like I'm not trying to answer the question, but I've never worked for them. I do not know. I've not spent enough time there to know, and it's not a channel that I watch because clearly it's in Arabic and I don't understand Arabic, so it's not something that I can say. Others on the panel that may be coming later on, I think will definitely have a viewpoint. But can I say that coming out of New Zealand or coming out of Australia, governments try and influence channels in all ways. You have it in this country, I'm sure. I know I certainly have it in mine. You know, they're just not quite as upfront as some other people. You know, there is influence on this stuff all around the world. It's over to journalists to understand when they are being influenced and to make sure they take account of that accordingly and are not influenced, and that the story remains true to what it should be. I'm sorry I can't answer the question about the Arabic. I just don't know enough about it.
We do have time for one quick question. Sir, I see you at yes, if try to keep it brief, which they all have been so far. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Darwis from George Washington University, visiting scholar from Indonesia. My short question I would like to arise for Carter, that seems to me Al Jazeera is the representing Islamic international broadcasting in the world. Do you have difficulties to approach the Islamic extremists in the world, for instance, like Taliban and GA in Indonesia, and etc., or you have special connection with Al Qaeda? Thank you very much.
That's me. I have a special connection with Al Qaeda. It's written all over me, isn't it? No, is the short answer to that. I think that those organisations are as suspicious of journalists no matter where they come from. I'm sure that they like to think, perhaps, that you know, they have special relationships with their own media. I think that quite a few of these organisations are pretty marketing and PR savvy in their own way. But no, I don't think that any of the journalists, and bearing in mind that we hired from nothing, it wasn't like we hired a group of journalists that were already with their feet under the desk and going for it. They came from all different cultures, so they all had to build up their contact bases from scratch. And so I don't think that we have any special entree into that world at all. I think that that people are generally suspicious of the media. Having said that, I think that, you know, Asian people as such were very pleased to have their stories told. But if you want, you know, if you're suggesting that because we are meant to be so-called terror TV, that we have a special entree into terrorist organisations,